and welcome to Macro Matters. My name's Stephanie Kelly, and together with my co-host Paul Diggle, we guide you here through the complex world of politics, economics, and markets. Last week marked President Biden's first 100 days in office, which he used as an opportunity to promote his domestic and foreign policies.
America's moving forward, but we can't stop now. We're in competition with China and other countries to win the 21st century. We're at a great inflection point in history.
So we talked about Biden's domestic infrastructure package in a recent episode, but what we've talked about a little bit less is the foreign policy side, which we know is super important, not only from a political perspective, but from a market perspective. After the last 4 years under President Trump and the recent 100 days, the questions about China, US relationship with allies, but also with rivals, and the long-term geopolitical stability are absolutely crucial questions for investors. So to help me answer some of these questions, I'm delighted to welcome our guest for this week, Jeffrey Wright. Jeffrey is an analyst at Eurasia Group's North America practice, focusing primarily on Congress and US fiscal, foreign, trade, and regulatory policy, as well as on presidential politics. Thanks for joining, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Steph.
So I thought we could kick off, and this is maybe a kind of a cruel question to kick off with to start, but I wanted to ask if you could sum up Biden's foreign policy approach, maybe relative to Trump, maybe in isolation, in kind of one sentence. How would you summarize it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's, at the risk of focusing too much on one part of the world, I think it's return to allies and focus on China. And that's been the big theme of the first 100 days plus of Biden's foreign policy, is trying to repair relationships with allies, both in Europe and in Asia. And within that effort, trying to refocus US foreign policy on China, which means away from the Middle East, away from the trade conflicts of the Trump period to the extent possible, and trying to refocus those alliance relationships on containing China, which has been we can talk about it, but I think been a mixed bag so far.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in particular that delineation between, in some ways, back to normal or back to expected relationships, but at the same time that China relationship continuing to be a challenge is super interesting. And one of the things I'm keen that we kind of talk about as we go through is just how linked the foreign policy agenda that he's got is to his domestic policy agenda. As I mentioned in the intro, we spoke a lot about the infrastructure package a couple of weeks back, but a lot of the way you could read the infrastructure package is around the US being self-sufficient and crucially not reliant on China.
Yeah, I think these linkages sort of go both ways in some ways. I mean, you saw there is a domestic political angle to the China argument, and Biden has used that very extensively in his speech last week, his speech to a joint session of Congress. He emphasized repeatedly how important the infrastructure investments that he's pitching to Congress are in terms of competition with China. So it's not about, we should build a modern semiconductor industry because it'll be good jobs for Americans. It's about, this is part of our broader competition with China. And then you see the reverse as well, where the US is on several different fronts connecting domestic policy initiatives to foreign policy ones. And one that springs to mind straight away is the OECD tax process and the interaction of that with Biden's own proposals for international taxation. So this is a place where the US has been, the stumbling block in the OECD process for at least 6 or 7 years now. And Biden it looks like going to move the US towards closer to a compromise position as part of his taxation proposals for the American jobs and families plan. So there are, I think, definite places of linkage, and it goes in both directions, using China as an argument for domestic policy and then using the investments he wants to make domestically to drive consensus on the international stage.
Yeah,
climate would be another one.
Yeah. Well, let's get into all of that, because I think you've touched on a couple of the issues I was really keen that we do get to. So let's start then with the first thing you said, right? Which is like restoring relationships that were long understood to be stable, that were really called into question under President Trump. And, it's the kind of allies are allies again, because it did feel like under the Trump administration, particularly partners in Europe felt less certain about what the nature of that relationship with the United States was. I mean, how different do you think it is under President Biden? Maybe let's start with allies in the West, so particularly Europe, maybe Canada, places like that.
I think that the shift is meaningful, and you can either focus on the ways in which it has succeeded, and then the places where it's fallen short. So I think the major theme we're seeing across U.S. allies and partners is a willingness to return in some ways to the way the relationship with the U.S. used to be, but also not willing to totally defer to the U.S. in perhaps the way that they did for Trump. There is a real recognition, I think, particularly among allies in Europe, but in Asia as well, that the lesson that Trump provided, they can't ignore. Basically, the idea that the U.S. under either political alignment is going to be an ally and a dependable ally, that is not a conclusion that you can hold anymore. So I think the pattern we've seen is countries are willing to follow U.S. leadership in places where they see advantage in doing so, but also that they're not. There's not a lot of willingness to sign up, full bore for some sort of U.S.-led initiative. I think this becomes particularly relevant with China, right? You don't see a lot of Asian allies signing up for what the U.S. is trying to do with China and Asia, and a lot of that is because you have no assurances from their perspective that Trump, either Trump himself or a conservative in the style of Trump might not be president in 3 years.
Exactly.
Which I think makes it very hard for the U.S. to present any kind of durable solution to these problems. I mean, there's going to be tactical alignment for the next few years, but countries are going to want to keep their options open because there's no guarantee.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that sense of, there's like a famous phrase here in the UK that I think one of the central bankers used, or one of the politicians used about a central banker, saying they were like an unreliable boyfriend. You never knew when they were going to show up. And I think in a way you do see the same kind of issue coming through, which is in a system that's as divided as the United States is. And again, here's where the domestic plays into the foreign policy as well, right? In such a divided domestic political system, your allies feel less certain about how much longevity you'll have. And so I think what was really interesting to me is maybe two things. One is, I think there can be an assumption that now, even under Biden, that we can assume that there's not going to be any issues between Europe and the US. And to me, it's more like, you can have a disagreement with a stranger on the street, or you can have a disagreement with a friend, and those both happen. They're both normal to happen. But if you disagree with your friend, you still know your friends. And to me, that's what Biden brings, is not necessarily that they can easily solve the tariff issues, around Boeing and Section 232 tariffs, but that at least you have someone who is signaling he wants to work constructively, which to me feels different than the Trump administration.
That's absolutely true. So in that respect, those relationships have improved. And I think, this is dissipating now somewhat, that Biden has been in office for some time now, but at least initially there was a huge measure of relief, I think, in European capitals about the fact that Biden won, and that the transition, as rocky as it was, that it came off in the end. I think, maybe the more troubling signal for, U.S. allies and those more broadly who are invested in sort of the U.S.-led global system is not so much about Biden or Trump themselves, but about the changes in the U.S. political system that are much deeper than either of them, that for a variety of reasons are going to make it much harder for the U.S. to engage in the traditional role that it's played, certainly since the end of the Cold War. So, just to really oversimplify, but you have in both parties a real distrust of trade and globalization that has taken hold. Biden, of course, in previous moments in his career has been, a big advocate for globalization. But the politics of the Democratic Party have changed so much with, the increased prominence of unions and the power of the left that, something like advocating trade expansion, even like advocating return to TPP, like Obama did, just 6 years ago, would be a political non-starter for him. And of course, Trump has totally scrambled the conversation about trade on the right as well. So you have these, I think, more lasting changes in the politics of the U.S. And even aside from trade, you just have much deeper partisanship that makes it much harder, I think, for the U.S. to play that role of like the mediating force in the global system that countries can count on. And now, it's quite clear, I think, that's not something that can't be a constant. So countries have to operate in that new environment. And
it's really interesting that you mentioned that. And I know you mentioned climate earlier, because it feels a little bit like climate is an area where the US has taken a complete 180 in terms of the kinds of commitments to climate, both at home and abroad, that you're seeing. But equally, the ability for other countries to really buy into the US as an actual leader, rather than like, we're glad that you're at the party right now, but we think you might leave at some point and we're just going to carry on and do what we're going to do. How much of an issue or a problem do you think that is? Or do you think that that's just a function of, the broader climate agenda is ultimately going to be driven by domestic politics in every country, such that it doesn't matter that much if the US is on or off?
I think it's a huge problem from the perspective of U.S., from the idea that the U.S. can lead the climate fight. I think we have, that idea has been pretty comprehensively debunked at this point. This is now the third time that the U.S. has entered and then exited a global climate process.
Yeah. And
so I just don't think, from the perspective of third countries, it's realistic to look at the U.S. and think like they're going to be leading the climate fight. Now, on the bright side, that might mean that there is more, more dynamism in global climate policy. I tend to think that without the U.S. pressing countries for more ambitious emissions reductions, then that's probably a suboptimal outcome. But the U.S. is really hamstrung here by its domestic policies. Everyone knows that Biden can't promise very much because he has only a very limited set of tools to use domestically, and even those are potentially undercut by the courts. And of course, we have a much more conservative Supreme Court than was the case just a few years ago. So Biden's ability to promise, he can come into the Paris process and say, okay, the U.S. is going to reduce emissions by X amount over these years. I think that is all taken by other countries as a totally notional idea. I mean, they'll accept it to the extent that it happens, but I don't think anyone is counting on it, because the U.S. has shown time and again that the domestic politics of this issue are too unstable. And the other development here, I think, is that climate politics are now being sort of subsumed into the broader U.S.-China standoff. And, that's, I think, a pretty interesting new development where you have both of them talking about how they want to cooperate on climate, but the real cooperation is about sort of competing with each other for who can be the sort of perceived as the leader of the process among unaligned third countries, which is, I would say it's a competitive form of cooperation.
Yeah, totally. I think this is probably, we're inevitably now going to go into US-China, because I think we've talked about obviously allies being allies, but it's also this sense that rivals are rivals. And, I hopefully we'll get on to talk about Russia a bit as well, because I think that's a marked difference since the Trump administration as well. But actually on China, it is that sense that the issues are different, but they're actually, to me, they feel like harder to solve, because, Biden talks a lot about, in terms of issues he takes with China, human rights, transparency, and cybersecurity, right? Which even having a conversation with another country, particularly China, where they admit that any of this is an issue, or these are, these domestic policy issues are up for debate, which China says they are absolutely not up for debate, and it is none of the US's business. at the same time as then you see so many elements of the Build Back Better approach that Biden is selling, which is fundamentally, to your point, like a trade protectionist agenda. It's about, I mean, it's kind of make America great, just with a, you know, a more of a left-wing slant, but it's the same thing, which is like, we need to create jobs at home, and in particular, energy policy through climate action becomes another kind of string to the bow of US-China rivalry, because the US doesn't want to be reliant on China for technology, for, you know, anything in that climate space. And so all this money going into research and development and capacity creation, it kind of all feels like it's feeding into the same, what feels like less volatile day to day, because it's not like I'm going to put my tariffs up because you're not buying enough soybeans. But in some ways, it's much harder to solve longer term because you've got all these much more complex issues at play.
Yes, I think what you've seen, and some of this was the case under Trump as well, but I think his sort of clownish approach to these problems occasionally obscured the real depth of the disagreements between the US and China, which are really real and go very deep. And, you know, I think the two issues that you pointed out that are really fundamental to this conflict, one is human rights. The US and China just have very different conceptions of what human rights mean, and the balance between, you know, the rights of the individual and the collective. Those are very fundamental disagreements. And the other ones are sort of China's sovereignty issues, which China sees Xinjiang and Taiwan and Hong Kong as issues of its own sovereignty. And of course, sovereignty is a very sensitive subject in China, you know, historically speaking. So I think you're right. In some ways, the development of the Biden era has been that the US-China conflict is shifting onto more fundamental grounds. It's not anymore about the kinds of transactional disputes that Trump was raising about the trade deficit, for example, which are, you know, while we saw during the Trump era how difficult they are to solve, at least in theory, they're solvable, right? There would be a number in the middle that they.
Yeah, there's like a mechanical way to do it, right? It's like A plus B.
Right. But like a question like, should Taiwan be part of a unified China ruled by the CCP?
Yeah.
That's not a question. You can't split the baby on that. I mean, there's really no way to do that. So yes, I think the US-China conflict is deepening and becoming more about sovereignty issues and really fundamental issues for both sides that make it harder to compromise.
I guess on that, because I think that idea that basically you've got these two major powers in this just, you know, deepening, widening dispute that's reaching into other areas. I mean, you know, we should definitely talk about the role of COVID in all of this, and, you know, the kind of competing diplomacy that's taking place there. But I guess that the question that it raises for me is just around, what does this mean for other countries? Like, what are the spillover effects? And in particular, you know, are there beneficiaries? Are there any countries that can benefit from the US-China strategic rivalry? I'm thinking here maybe in like the COVID diplomacy space. Are there net beneficiaries? And equally though, you know, what do Western partners do when they are put under pressure to speak out? For example, you know, around human rights abuses in Xinjiang, there was a coordinated response there. Even beyond China, with Russia, there's coordinated response there. But I mean, where do you think the pressure points are when it comes to other countries involved in this dispute?
It's a good question. I do think there is room for third countries to benefit to some extent. That benefit, though, is totally contingent on the US and China not going to war, right? I think there are states of tension in which you can imagine countries like Vietnam, I think it's clear, has already benefited from movement of supply chains out of China. I think Malaysia as well. Mm-hmm. I think you can even argue that the EU as a whole has benefited from China's, you know, eagerness to strike an investment agreement before Biden came into office. You know, the ratification is a separate story, but clearly, like, the EU's role as sort of the pivot of the international system between the US and China has brought it some benefits. All of that goes out the window, of course, if there is a war between the US and China, which would be, you know, catastrophic on many different levels. So yeah. I think, you know, much like the original Cold War, for the countries in the balance, there is some possibility of advantage. There's also a lot of downside if you are, the Cold War was full of proxy wars, for example. We haven't seen that so much between the U.S. and China, but that's a risk from history. More broadly, I think like maybe the focus for those countries is on trying not to align themselves too closely, which is another difference from the first Cold War. You of course have U.S. allies who are clearly allied with the U.S., China, and Canada and Australia, and the U.K. of course, the Five Eyes more broadly. But you also have this much larger group of countries that are trying to sort of navigate the middle, and succeeding with different levels of aplomb, I think. And so you look at someone like Japan, right? It's a U.S. treaty ally, covered by the U.S. nuclear umbrella, very, very close American partner, but also their economy is hugely dependent on trade with China, both from inputs and as an export market. And so the visit of Japanese Prime Minister Suga to Washington a few weeks ago was instructive in this regard, because he was working very hard to both satisfy demands from the U.S. that Japan ally more closely with them. He's gonna raise defense spending, for example, but also the statement that he gave on Taiwan was very careful not to anger the Chinese, not to endorse any sort of American diagnosis of the situation in Taiwan. So that's the challenge, I think, for a lot of third countries, is to try to maintain on one side what is their in Asia generally their most important commercial relationship with China, and then on the other side to maintain what's often their security guarantee from the U.S. South Korea is in the same boat, India to some extent. So these are very difficult problems to resolve, and I think the hope for most of these third countries is that they can kind of navigate the middle, and they hope that the U.S. and China can come to some kind of détente that allows them to de-escalate the conflict.
I think there's so many things I want to ask you as a follow-up to that, but I think that idea of treading the tightrope feels very appropriate, even for third countries, even for kind of official allies, like for Europe trying to simultaneously have this investment deal with China. And there was this whole thing when Biden came in that he wouldn't speak to von der Leyen because she had been at the center of the orchestrating of the investment deal between China. So there was like a period of time after he came in where he spoke to some European leaders, but not her. And supposedly it was because of this investment deal, because he wasn't happy it had taken place before he came in, right? So I think it feels like it puts them in a difficult position. And so long as this kind of uneasy balance is maintained, but in some ways, even the positive spillovers can be negative if it's in the context of just a broader escalation, right? It's like the more you see, if the US decides it's going to be a huge provider of vaccines to key emerging markets where China is also, that is positive for the emerging markets in question for the time being. But if it's an articulation of a broader competition, is that actually longer term? And this is where I'm going to ask you such an unfair question, is how do you think, or how do you think this is going to play out? And particularly, are you someone who worries actively about things like, Taiwan and any kind of direct military intervention? What are the things that I guess keep you up at night when it comes to this relationship?
It's a great question. I don't think Taiwan is a particular near-term risk. I do think in the next 10 years, it becomes a much more acute risk. It doesn't seem to me that the Chinese are willing or able to forcibly return Taiwan right now. Mm-hmm. But, military spending is growing. It's clearly a focus of Xi, and it's a long-term focus of the party. So yes, I think in the long term, there are very substantial risks for Taiwan. I think the thing that really worries me, if you were to try to game out like a worst case scenario, is an accident. That's the thing that I think is the scariest. I mean, the U.S. and China had several different accidents. The U.S. bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, I think in 1999, and then a U-2 accident in the early days of the Bush administration. Both of which were resolved, but not without some very difficult negotiations. And now the environment is so different. I mean, that was taking place in an environment of unchallenged US supremacy after the fall of the Berlin Wall and before 9/11, sort of the apex of US power. And so China really had no choice but to accommodate itself. And I think that attitude has really changed in the last 20 years. I mean, China, I think we can debate what they ultimately want out of this, whether they want to usurp the US as the global hegemon or whether they just want to be one among many. But I think what's clear is that China resents the way that the US dictates global policy to them, and the way that the US benefits from post-war institutional arrangements that were designed by US policymakers. Right. And it wants a reevaluation of those rules that respects its newfound power. And that's from the way the Biden administration has reacted, it seems clear to me that is not a discussion the US is willing to have. And so, in that context, I think you could imagine, okay, maybe there will be a different US approach somewhere down the line. I tend to think that's hard to imagine, certainly not from a more conservative administration, but it's possible. It's also possible the Chinese could moderate their own ambitions, and maybe as they get richer, that's possible as well.
So I think I guess what you're outlining is essentially a change of tack is what's required from either side or both to avoid this competition continuing to gradually escalate over time. On that, and you mentioned this, right, it's like, what is the likelihood of under conservative administration? This again brings it back to the role of domestic politics and how deeply divided the Republicans and Democrats are in general, but actually not necessarily on China. But do you have a sense that if, for example, a Republican wins the White House in 2024, that you're likely to see a situation where US-China tensions escalate much more significantly than what we're likely to see under Biden? And again, this isn't assuming that Trump gets reelected, but I guess my question is around the nature of like conservative party politics when it comes to China and what's seen as like a prudent foreign policy in that space.
Yes, I think that is a reasonable assumption, because the conversation around China has shifted so dramatically in the Republican Party that it has become even divorced from its significance as an international player, which is sort of its own thing. But China has become a very useful tool for conservative politicians because it allows them to, of course, it ties in with anger about COVID. Trump sort of pioneered this. So yes, I think a very hawkish approach to China is going to be a factor in almost any subsequent Republican administration. And, in a lot of ways, this is a continuation of what happened under Trump. I mean, the politics, you just look at someone like Mike Pompeo, who wants to run for president in 2024, made his whole, much of his tenure as Secretary of State was focused on finding any way that he could to poke China. So just on his way out the door, they changed these rules about U.S. diplomats meeting with Taiwanese diplomats that have enraged the Chinese, the Xinjiang genocide designation. All of these things are, Pompeo imagines, and I think he's probably right, will play well someday in a Republican primary. And you look at, if you repeat those incentives throughout the whole party, you're going to get a lot of very aggressive anti-China measures. It may not end up in a war, but it certainly, I think, bolsters the arguments of people in Beijing who are arguing, look, the U.S. will never let us rise to their level. And, they're on a mission to contain our rise. And so, it becomes very hard, I think, to disabuse Chinese political actors of that impression when Americans are constantly sort of saying so out loud.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh.
There's a very interesting, in Blinken's interview with 60 Minutes this weekend, he tried to make this point where he said, basically, we don't oppose China's rise, we just oppose them trying to change the rules of what he calls the rules-based international system, which I think is, this is their job, of course, but it does seem like a very hard distinction to make because the system and the rules, I think, are essentially inextricable from one another. So, but that's the hope from the U.S. side is they can distinguish the rules of the game from China's position within it.
Wow. I mean, that just seems like such an unlikely thing, right? Because they fundamentally have a different system, believe in a different system, and want to function within their own system, right? That's always the Chinese argument, is they just want to be able to function the way they choose to without interference from, external players. And the external players are saying, well, we'll play with you, but you just have to change the way you act. And it's just such a fundamentally, the
Chinese are also drawing on a very deep reservoir of resentment about the way that the U.S. engages with the system, right? It's like the thing you hear from a lot of Europeans and others is like that this rules-based system that the U.S. is now touting with respect to China, that those rules are optional when it comes to the U.S.
Yeah,
and I think that's another undercut to this argument. I mean, it makes it very hard, I think, to do Blinken's job or Biden's, because there's not a lot of trust in the U.S. Left after the Trump years, and even before that. I think this goes way back to the Iraq War and well before that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we really finished on a bright note for everyone to go away worrying about long-term U.S.-China tensions. But thank you so much, Jeff, for joining. I think that was super interesting. There are so many topics that we still didn't get to, so we might have to have you back on again to talk a little bit.
I would love to. Thank you, Steph. It was my pleasure.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And as always, to our listeners, if you have any comments on the discussion today, questions or ideas for future episodes, you can email us at macromatters@aberdeenstandard.com. In the meantime, we'll be back next week, so please join us then.
Please note that email is not a secure form of communication, so don't send any personal or sensitive information. This podcast is provided for general information only and assumes a certain level of knowledge of financial markets. It is provided for information purposes only and should not be considered as an offer, investment recommendation, or solicitation to deal in any of the investments or products mentioned herein, and does not constitute investment research. The views in this podcast are those of the contributors at the time of publication and do not necessarily reflect those of Aberdeen Standard Investments. The value of investments and the income from them can go down as well as up, and investors may get back less than the amount invested. Past performance is not a guide to future returns. Return projections are estimates and provide no guarantee of future results.